We are recording. Happy Monday, everyone. Thanks for making it to the new time for Gateway API meetings. This is May 10, and of course, we're rotating between different times now going forward, and hopefully that allows more of us to show up at different times and be involved. But with that, thanks to everyone for making it. The first topic I wanted to get through here is the reworking of gateway and route binding. Now, this is kind of we're starting a whole lot of new things today. One, we have themes for every meeting. That means that each meeting is going to be covering a large topic, so you can see in advance the large topics we're getting through. And I want to be intentional with starting with that, because usually we have more than enough to get through with issue triage, PRs, etc., which is great. But I want to make sure that since we're in V1 Alpha 2 and we have this window where we can make breaking changes, that we take advantage of that by really tackling these larger issues first. Today's specific discussion is in no ways new. I think it's going to be pretty familiar to many of us, and I think we already mostly have consensus here. So I wanted to start with one that, although it's large, may be familiar and maybe something like that we are close to agreement on. So with that, let me run through and open up the issues that started this discussion. Mark, I think you had the first issue on this, and this was really suggesting that our open selection by default was not a great experience. The idea that by default, a gateway, when you create it, selects all routes in the same namespace felt like a default we didn't want to have. I think there were another couple things here, but a key recommendation was, can we make route selector a required field? And an empty selector would therefore not select anything. This is something that we talked about briefly, but we immediately identified, hey, this is a breaking change, so we can't do anything. Let's wait until V1 Alpha 2. And what do you know? We're at V1 Alpha 2 now. So this, I think, is one of the inspiring issues, probably the first one that came up. And then the other issue is really related to this doc, and it's one that I created here. It's 594, and this explored some different ways we could try and improve this route selection. And this really is, this issue is really coming from this doc where I was writing through all these different approaches. I think many of us have seen this already, but stop me if there's places that seem unfamiliar, strange, don't make sense, whatever. This was actually, I remember this, and it's called out right in the intro, watching TGIK actually and seeing a number of new people try this API out and see what they expected and then see what actually our API did, made it clear that it was more confusing than I think we wanted it to be. So that, combined with Mark's earlier feedback in that issue, made it seem like, hey, we need some room for improvement here. I tried to outline the existing patterns we have here. So, the simple one, gateway selects a route. That's easy. Our cross namespace selection is relatively complicated because you have, arrows in each direction, lots of different things that have to agree with each other. Not necessarily the end of the world, but it is. It does add a lot of complexity when we do that cross namespace bit. But yeah, there's a variety of open issues. Route should be able to forward to cross namespaces. This I punted off till next week. Route should be able to select gateways by class. I think we ended up closing this. John, you may be, no? Okay. John, you're on this call. Do you remember what happened here? I know we, yeah, I guess it helps, but doesn't completely solve the specific use case.
Yeah,
Okay.
I mean, I've talked a bit with you, I think individually, like we could have the idea of, I'm not sure if everyone's familiar with the new selector labels that they've added to namespaces by default. It's like kubernetes.io/metadata.name. It's automatically added to every namespace. If we had a similar concept, whether actually on the resource or some sort of fake label selector, in theory, with the new selector design, you could add selectors on things like class, namespace name, or whatever else we want to add. I'm not sure if we need that, but it's a way that we could support this with the new selector API. If that makes sense.
So is the idea then you would have a route and you'd say, well, this route is okay to include on any gateway of class foo?
Yeah, like you could do something like selector kubernetes.io/metadata.class equals mesh, or maybe name equals my gateway, or namespace equals some gateway namespace, is the idea I was thinking of.
I guess
So we
what
probably
is
have to find constants on like what those mean.
Yeah, did you have like a practical use case in mind where people like might want to use that?
There's some examples here. Like one would be if your route, say, has like some Nginx authorization policy attached to it, and you want to make sure that no gateway classes other than Nginx select it. You could, explicitly say this must be something that's in the Nginx class. So then it would ensure that nothing else reads it. That's obviously solvable by saying that it's like a required policy, and maybe we should solve that in a different way.
Today the way you would kind of address this is you'd reference specific gateways by name. So I guess what I'm curious about is like what are the operational or the deployment use cases where specifying a gateway by name is awkward or insufficient.
Oh, yeah, I see. Makes sense. Yeah, I mean, Rob's proposal is to get rid of selecting by name. So this kind of adds a backdoor to do it still with the new selector, right? Like in Rob's proposal, from list is removed. So now it's only selectors. So yeah.
Yeah, that's a good point. I actually made that specific use case harder. I think an argument could be that instead of selecting by name, you might choose to label your gateways in a meaningful way, but I know that does lose some bit of the trust. I guess maybe a core concept I had is you're really granting trust to namespaces. You either trust the admins of a gateway in a gateways in a namespace, or you don't. And if someone can be an admin of a gateway in a given namespace, they're either trusted or they're not. There's not much more granularity that we can do there. Like I think the class, somebody could change what class name meant as an example, or someone could change. I don't know. Maybe that's reaching too far there. But that was at least my thought with this proposal, was that once you trust someone in a namespace, then, if they're a gateway admin, they can recreate the gateway name foo and do whatever they want with it. There's not much difference with a specific name of a gateway or class. I don't know. Okay, I'll keep on running. This is one that I need to follow back up with because I had missed this as I was running through things today. The other ones were just, we need better kubectl output. I'm working on that upstream. And the one that Mark described for a non-empty selector. So so I think many of you have seen this before. Yes, we can absolutely improve documentation. Yes, we can require a gateway route selector to specify labels. But what I really want to get down to before going through all these, relatively smaller changes is the larger, more dramatic option, which is the third option, which I proposed in the issue above. And so this is really just trying to take everything that we have in Gateway and recreate it on Route, which may seem like too much almost, but it does buy us a great deal of consistency, I think. So what we would have is, again, gateways would allow routes to connect to them within the same namespace by default. But routes would have to specify some kind of selector, would have to go out of their way to select gateways to connect to. So what this means is the focus shifts from gateways selecting routes to routes selecting gateways. And both options still work here. It's entirely possible to do the same workflows we had before, minus the gateway selects everything by default. That one thing doesn't work. But the big difference with this approach is routes are selecting gateways, and it looks something like this. So in this case, from selector, from same namespace, etc. It allows what I think is a fair amount of flexibility and a shift in focus that matches the kind of feedback at least I've been seeing initially, which shows that users create a route and then they want to attach that route to a gateway. So if that's the model that we're seeing, something like this seems to make sense to me. It enables almost all the existing functionality that exists. It keeps up with that, that use case that we've been presenting of, I have a gateway as a gateway admin, I want to replace it with another one. That can happen seamlessly. There's kind of this loose coupling going on. And I think maybe most importantly, instead of the route and gateway config being slightly different, they become nearly identical in shape and function. And I think that may be easier to understand. Yeah, so any questions with this approach, any feedback, hesitation? I recognize this is a big change.
With the feedback, Rob, are you getting feedback from people deploying production applications with this API?
No, this is, I'll clarify that my feedback is from internal testers when we were in private preview for GKE. So it's a fairly small set.
Okay, because I think one of the original assertions behind the gateway route split was that we have these personas, right?
Yeah.
These personas and around production safety and production deployment roles. So I'm wondering if we're altering that model, are we altering it in response to feedback from people who are like trying to do things in production, or is it that people who are just kind of playing with it and experimenting it are not doing the same sorts of things that you would do when you're trying to manage a real app, or don't have the same sort of organizational structure?
Isn't part of it that that this is direct results of feedback of people having a hard time understanding what was going on?
Yeah, I think you're both right. I think that this is the direct result of confusion from users. Though I would say I don't know of any users right now that are using this API in production. They very well could exist. So we don't have a lot of great, production feedback, or I don't yet, unfortunately. But what I would say is from the limited initial feedback, alpha feedback I've gotten, this has been a confusing system.
I would say, Rob, we did get both. I mean, we got users, we get both classes of problems. We got users that were just confused by it. And then we also got users or field folks that used it and said, this is totally not going to work for my customer. And specifically, the empty selector that would select routes, all routes, was the biggest source of friction. There was some feedback that was like, well, banking would never allow something where a user could leave something out and it would expose more routes than they intended. That was feedback we heard a couple times. And so, yeah, and the two kind of persona use cases that we saw are one where the gateway administrator wanted to be the ones that basically determined which routes were exposed. Like basically they looked at the routes and said, okay, I will determine how these routes get exposed. And then there was another gateway persona that was interested in just more self-service. Like, here are the gateways that exist. You can choose how to expose yourselves. And so those are kind of the two paths that we saw.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And I should clarify, Mark is much more in touch with customers than I am on this side. So yeah, thank you for the clarification there. Yeah, and that matches my expectation, at least, that having more sane defaults, or more, I hate to say secure defaults, but anything like this would help with visibility, would help with buy-in from those larger organizations that are more security conscious, and really, like Mark said, that concern about exposing things accidentally. That's not anything anyone wants to do. And if you kind of switch the world around and you make it the route owner's responsibility to say, I want to be exposed on X, and if they don't say that, they're exposed on nothing, that feels like a pretty significant win for any kind of security posture. Okay. Any more questions or comments on this? So I do want to highlight here that this is obviously not all just wins. This is very clearly a breaking API change, and a relatively significant one at that. I also have to recognize that this two-way selection model could get more confusing. It's not, this is different, but I don't want to just make a change for the sake of being different. I want it to be something that is easier to understand. I think from my limited perspective, this is easier to understand for the simple use case of my route is going to bind to this set of gateways, or this gateway specifically. So I just want to say gateways XLB, or whatever implementation I want here, and it works. And that feels pretty compelling to me. On the other hand, I recognize the more options we provide, it does mean the most complex case is still quite complex here. If you have real two-way selection happening, that could get messy. The other proposal is, the other thing that I think is unfortunate is we have this precedent in Kubernetes that a empty selector should select everything. I think that's really not a great standard, but that is what is in the Kubernetes API definition for Meta v1 label selector. We have some precedent with service with an empty selector not selecting anything by default. So I think we can kind of carry on from that and say something similar. But we do have to recognize that this is different than the pure upstream definition of what a selector should do. So I think those are the negatives. I'm interested if anyone else has additional negatives that we could point out here, or positives. Any thoughts?
I think the fact that the route selector behavior is like the service view, makes that one less of a big problem in my book. The defaulting meaning, not select anything. I think it's better for security, as you say, and also if given that that's how the service works, I think we can be like, look, we're working in the same space as the service, and it makes more sense to do it this way. So the prior art is quite a good case here.
Yeah, no, I agree. I can't imagine the UX if service empty selector selected all pods in the namespace. That just, I can't imagine what that would result in. But yeah, so glad we have that prior art. I think, this is just a simple example to try and show what this could result in. So you've got a gateway with a simple label, and you just say, hey, I want to expose my route using gateway of class with this label. And similarly for the multi-listener example, this is a lot funkier, but this is kind of showing how bidirectional selection could work. So in this case, you add this thing of, okay, I want to select routes that support HTTP and routes that support HTTPS. And this is one potential way to do that. This is, again, a little funky, but in this case, this way of labeling the HTTP route says, okay, HTTP gateway, yes, I want to support this, but I don't want to support HTTPS, or vice versa. This feels like a bit of a stretch. There may be a better way to do that, but this was one way to work around this kind of bidirectional approach. I don't know if this is the best example here, but I just tried to explore what a multi-listener world may look like, where you don't want a route to bind to every listener in the gateway. And this is one option for that. Okay, well, I'll keep on going with this. There's a lot in this doc, so I want to encourage people to take some time to review it. I think James asked if I could send this out to the mailing list again. I think that's a good idea to get some more eyes on this and see what the broader audience thinks of this kind of change. It is a pretty significant one. And, I recognize it is likely not perfect, but any feedback, any ideas would be really helpful on this. Let me run back through this issue, because I think there was at least a little bit more conversation here. John, I think you mentioned, so we had some consensus here, but more recently, John mentioned that we don't have a good answer for port matching right now. So it's possible to do that kind of last example I showed, but that may not be everything we ever want to do. So I think this is maybe a little bit something like we can move outside of this conversation potentially. And if we really need port matching, we could do it as like similar to how hostname works, where it is almost like a matcher on the route, as opposed to something that's tied to gateway route binding. But maybe that may be naive too. But that's something that we really don't have a great answer to, or as natural of an answer to, when you switch the selection model around from route up to gateway. Yeah.
So to be completely honest, I haven't read any of this. So I'm seeing all this. I need to sit down and read through the doc. But is it actually simplifying things? I think at the point where you're duplicating things or making the same API available across like gateways and routes, then I'm not sure if it feels simpler.
Yeah.
I wonder if you're like making the model, by moving things, by being able to do the same thing, now in two different ways, your you know, the responsibilities of objects in the model become blurry, which makes the whole thing kind of more harder to reason about. So
Yeah.
I need to read it properly to have better feedback, but
I was gonna say I found
it.
the API changes. I think I actually did a pretty good job of making the most common use cases really easy, and the least common use cases require a little more work. Like, so it feels like it does prioritize kind of on the things that are most likely to, or the types of matches that are most likely to be used. So yeah, anyways.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I appreciate that feedback. From both of you. I think, Mark, like you're saying, this emphasizes this simple example, and I think the simple example is better than our simple example today. That's my naive interpretation, but I also get where you're coming from, James, especially looking at all the config, all the potential config that is available here is rather overwhelming. And there are lots of different ways you could do this that could get quite confusing. And when you start to look at those more advanced use cases, you could very, very likely start to wonder, well, is this actually simpler?
Yeah, I guess maybe we need to just lay out, maybe we need to think about what are the invariants that we're trying to preserve here, right? So what are the, I think someone before mentioned the security model. So like, okay, so does this change the security model? Does it enforce the security model? Is that what aspects of the security model are sort of required to be retained as we, change the way you express that?
Yeah, that makes sense. And I do think that fundamentally what we should focus on here is trusted namespaces, right? So if really what we care about is, as a gateway admin, you care about what namespaces you trust route admins in. Because beyond that, that's really as far as you can go. Once someone can create routes in a namespace, they can do whatever they want to connect to your gateway. So the namespace boundary is really the key thing for gateway admins, and likely similar for route admins. But if the primary concept here that we're trying to switch is that route admins are selecting up, that route admins are defining what gateways they want to connect to, and gateway admins are primarily concerned with describing where they trust route admins, maybe I think this model still works for that, but there's a lot of possible configuration here, and maybe we don't need every little bit of it, but I'm not sure yet. But you're right, we need to be very clear about the use cases we want. I don't think this fundamentally changes our security model, but it is good to keep those roles in mind and how we imagine those personas interacting. All right, well, this doc will be visible for, it's already gotten some good feedback, but any new comments, any thoughts would be good. I'll try and respond to them on here or on, I think this issue is kind of an umbrella issue that tracks discussion as well. So whatever works, would appreciate any kind of feedback on this. Any last thoughts? I know we have other things to go through, so I don't want to take all our time on this, but any last thoughts or discussion we should have around this gateway route relationship?
Well, one thing that comes to mind is, I think this is to James' point, is, I think this bidirectional binding is just difficult to simplify, no matter how we slice it. So I wonder if we just changed our mindset and said, you know, we're not going to have this bidirectional relationship, and routes just bind to all gateways. And in doing so, we look at other existing APIs for the more security conscious use cases. So I'm thinking like the network policy API. Is that something that we could possibly utilize, where for the more security conscious use case, you know, we could potentially either use or add to the network policy API to create some kind of policies around which routes and gateways can bind to one another.
Yeah, it's interesting. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say basically the same thing. That's a really interesting idea. Like if our assumption is that, you know, the user that creates the gateway is more privileged, like when way back at the start we had this idea that, okay, gateways select routes, so there's a very clear unidirectional flow of responsibility, and then we've now got a bidirectional flow. But yeah, I think there's precedent for extracting the policy out into a separate object. So one way could be having gateways select routes, and then you have a separate route policy object where if you are a route owner and you want to say something else, then you could say it in that separate object to get your bidirectional, so it's not right in your face the whole time. That's kind of it. It's an interesting idea.
I think we really need to be careful about the number of CIDs though.
Yes. Yeah, and I think the unfortunate part of selectors is, by definition, we end up with some level of bidirectional agreement. Not agreement, but coordination. So with a selector, the resources you're selecting have to be labeled, with matching labels. And so if I, as a gateway admin, say I want to select all routes with app equals foo, and someone creates a new route and happens to label it that way, then they're basically just choosing to attach themselves to that gateway. So you do have the two roles interacting in some way. And what I think we're most concerned about here is trying to define the level of trust involved. And the story within a namespace is very straightforward, because really within a namespace, you have to assume that you trust other operators within that namespace. If someone can create a route in the same namespace as a gateway, they likely should be able to attach the two. The part that gets confusing is when you cross that namespace boundary, and that's where all our kind of advanced bidirectional logic really belongs. Maybe there's a better, simpler way to do that, but I am hesitant to introduce too many additional forms of config, CRDs, etc., if we don't have to. But with that said, I'm very, very interested. Like, if there are other proposals, I think primarily right now I've just written up a doc and an issue and etc. But if anyone else has different thoughts, if you want to add them to the existing doc, create your own, whatever, I'm very interested in exploring more than just this. Don't want to have a monopoly on this idea or concept.
And part of the point that I was trying to make was not necessarily introducing another CRD, but taking advantage of existing like network level policy, like the network policy API or something along those lines. Where we'd say by default, gateways and routes, whatever gateways you have, the routes will bind to them unless you use the network policy API and specify X, Y, or Z to restrict certain routes from binding to certain gateways or vice versa. That's kind of what I was thinking, as opposed to saying, let's add another CRD to our CRD list. But I guess I'm thinking more of the network policy API, but I guess I don't know how that would work because it's not like these are two different pods that are trying to communicate with each other. We're basically saying, hey, this route, which is essentially a configuration snippet being added to a particular gateway, right?
Yeah, I think that
Yeah.
it would make sense to me that if you're going to have something extra, it would be a policy decision, right? If you're going to have something that controls that relationship, it would need to be a policy object of some sort, but network policy doesn't seem like the right one.
You're right. Yeah.
Yeah, if I would say, like, if the number of gateways is large and the number of routes is large, then it feels like it makes more sense to have a policy resource that kind of has all the mapping and like what's allowed as a kind of external resource. But if the number of gateway resources are few, then it's almost like a lot of your mapping is just on the gateway itself, which isn't that much of an issue if there's not many of them. That's kind of I guess the assumption we've been going off of is that there's not going to be that many gateways. Maybe one per namespace, or a handful per cluster, some kind of relationship like that. But yeah, I think it's an interesting. I'd be interested to see examples where like the amount of policy is too great for the users because they have many gateways, and where I think that might be useful. Yeah.
So in practice, gateways, people are going to make gateways. People who are using cloud providers are going to make gateways a privileged operation, right? Because a gateway is going to create some cloud provider resource, which is going to cost you money. So is that a correct assumption?
Not so. I wouldn't say that's. We've had a lot of discussion around gateway being able to provision instances of implementations of this API within a namespace scope. If we're thinking of in-cluster proxies, those kinds of things, and for those use cases, I do think we want the ability to have a namespace scoped implementation of this API. And if that's the case, then creating a gateway resource may not be as constrained. It may be more constrained by class or some other thing with OPA, as like we had those earlier discussions about how you could restrict by class.
Yeah, I think that there's two, from what I've seen so far, there's definitely two broad categories of gateways that will be created. There's the one that James is talking about, that is the please create me and essentially an upstream load balancer or some other sort of external to the cluster thing. And then there's the ingress controller style use case. That's the please this gateway describes is like a bucket to hold the config for an ingress controller that requires some other way to get the traffic into the cluster, probably another gateway. Yeah, so for example, in Contour's case, Contour is an ingress controller, it's an in-cluster proxy. In order to get the traffic to the envoys that Contour uses, you need something else. That something else is either a service of type load balancer or a gateway of the other, I don't want to use the word class, but of the other type. So I think so far, that's the main things I've seen is two broad classes of gateways, broad types of gateways, sorry, that are sort of cloud load balancer, for lack of a better word, and in-cluster proxy. And I think they are going to have different, there's an extent to which they will have slightly different security postures. And
Yep.
I would guess that it's actually going to be pretty hard to move gateway objects between classes that fulfill those two different contracts. So I wouldn't expect that you could pick up a gateway that describes a GKE load balancer and turn it into a Contour load balancer that easily, because there's going to be stuff. It's very likely that there'll be something on there that's specific to one implementation or the other.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think that's where the seamless replacement, the idea of you could spin up a new gateway of class foo, Contour, GKE, whatever it is, right? And it might have a couple different settings, but it could target all the same routes and everything else, and it could be somewhat seamless in nature. But it's an imperfect thing for sure. I think, Mark, one of your key points is something that we should remember here that we're talking about in most cases a few gateways per cluster, or maybe 10, like a relatively small amount. So we do need to get this configuration right, but we do also need to remember that it's something that users aren't going to be interacting with every day. So probably a focus on precision and capability over the simplest possible API would be my bias.
I think that makes sense to me in the sense that there's already the simplest possible API available. That's Ingress. You're like, that's the simplest possible API that could describe most of the things that we're talking about here. Possibly service to type load balancer as well. But like, and I think the thing that we need to keep in mind as well is that there's a not insignificant onboarding cost to people actually learning how the Gateway API works. And if we want people to pick this API up and actually use it, that cost should be, there's going to be a cost, but we need to keep that in mind as a cost. Like if we're going to have, we've already got 4 different objects or something like that. If we add some policy objects on top of that, then it makes the mental model you have to build up more complicated and take you longer. And thus we either need really, really good documentation or we need to make it simpler.
So
Yeah.
I think
I agree.
I kind of want to quibble with that a little bit in that I think the complexity lies in the mental model. And you can, if you just simply because if the mental model is expressed in fields or if it's expressed in CRDs, can change how easy it is to digest. But I don't know that it's, I kind of wanted to push back a little bit on the idea that more CRDs is intrinsically more complex. Like it could be maybe in specific cases, but I also think that in specific cases, it can lead you to make the mental model like clearer.
I mean, the thing that I'm worried about is that we end up in a situation like Cert Manager, where you have, a certificate that creates a certificate request, that creates a certificate order, that creates or something else. There's one last one. And if you just care about getting a certificate in the end, you don't really care about the rest of that stuff. And it can be challenging to understand what's going on and to find the right place to look for something when it's broken. And that's the thing that I'm worried about is, like we can have extra things that may make it easier to configure this to start with, but then when it breaks, how do you find what the problem is? Where do you go to start, and how many hot hoops do you have to jump through to get to the thing that's broken?
Yeah, and they're important. They're definitely like important user experience things to think about.
Yeah, I guess what I'm trying to say is let's make sure we're thinking about the user experience and how it feels to use these things, because that's what people are going to remember, not how expressive the API. Like the thing that the people get, the sharp edges that people are going to remember about this is yes, how much it can fit their use case, but also if it breaks, how easy is it to troubleshoot, and how easy is it for the simple things. We're going to get a lot of tire kickers and people who are like, okay, I just want to implement the same thing that I did in Ingress. How hard is that? And there's, if we make that too hard, then people just won't use this.
Yeah, I would also say to bias towards the highest number of users. Well, we know the number of HTTP route users is going to be much greater than the number of users that are interacting with gateways. And so to bias towards their use case and to favor the HTTP route simplicity over gateway simplicity, because there's many, many more users that are not networking experts that are going to be using routes over gateways.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And I do want to close on this pretty soon, because we do have a few other things on the agenda. But I think that's a good point. Anything we can do to make the HTTP route, well, the route experience in general, more natural and make more sense to users is, I think, going to be a win. I remember that from TGIK, the gateway creation was straightforward, but then, how do I connect this route to my gateway? And anyways, I think there's plenty of room for more discussion here. So I think this translates well into my next question, which is what is the best way to get feedback, to provide feedback, to continue this discussion online? I have a few ideas. Obviously, there's an OSS issue. There's that doc that anyone can comment on. We've used docs pretty heavily for this, and I'm fine to continue that if that works. But I also have started to be thinking about what other projects are doing with enhancement proposals. Obviously, Kubernetes has their KEPs. Cluster API has CEP. I don't know if that's SEP. I don't actually know how they pronounce that. And Helm has their HIPs, but all have a fairly similar structure. And they're all improvement proposals, enhancement proposals, whatever you want to call them. I want to be careful about adding a concept like this, but I felt like as we're starting to get into this, big topic discussion and lots of big changes, it might be worth revisiting if we want to add any kind of process like this to Gateway API. I am concerned because it adds overhead, but on the other hand, it also adds some record of why we made the decisions we made and some kind of permanence with those decisions. Whereas right now our decisions are kind of scattered across issues, docs, and other things that may not be quite as easy to find as in-tree enhancement issues, whatever, enhancement docs. So with that said, I'm interested in if this kind of concept is something like we see valuable for Gateway API, or if it's fine to continue with docs and issues as we see fit, or PRs.
So the KEP process, like what goes into a KEP versus an issue in the Kubernetes land?
So basically
is there a discussion on the issue, I guess, like associated with the KEP?
So, okay, so yeah, there's in Kubernetes, every KEP has an associated issue, but that's mostly just for tracking. Usually what you'll see is someone will create an issue on k/k upstream, and it may be large enough in scope. That means any kind of API change, any kind of behavior change that, it's not just a bug fix, that they say, oh, you should file a KEP. And the KEP includes things like rationale and user stories sometimes, and then key API changes that you want to propose with this KEP. And the KEP also adds a lot more that I don't think is relevant here, like milestones tracking, alpha, beta, graduation, PRRs, all these other things that I think are far too heavy for a Gateway API, which is why I also
leave those empty.
Yeah, right. But I also reference Cluster API and Helm, which have lighter weight versions of those that are more focused on rationale and alternatives considered, which I think could be helpful, just as for anyone coming back through the API. Why did they do this? It could be helpful to have this, but I also recognize it's potentially adding a good bit of overhead. So I want to be careful with that.
So I think are you also suggesting that we have like a KEP? Is the KEP process going to be rolling, or we have like a KEP freeze? I think where the overhead comes is the freeze aspect of it in upstream.
Yeah, so I'm not anticipating any kind of freeze, though. Hey, maybe we'd get to that point eventually if we had firm deadlines for releases. That would actually probably make sense. But no, what I'm considering right now is just a way to formalize decisions and documents somewhere in between right now what we have, which is a whole bunch of docs and a whole bunch of issues and conversation that sometimes gets disconnected between the two of them. and maybe we could combine them into something that is like an enhancement proposal.
Yeah, I think it makes sense to me, just for note-taking purposes, if that is kind of how we're using the KEP on decisions made and rationale. Because right now, unless you summarize everything on the issue, it's not part of any process to basically make you write it down.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know.
Seems okay to me.
Yeah, I've definitely found a couple of times that it can be hard to catch back up with things if you haven't been able to look at what's going on in the repo for a while. Feels like a KEP-ish process would help with, bringing yourself back up to speed, or new people being able to come up to speed. Having to sort of go hunting for Google Docs is kind of, it makes the work harder to catch up.
Yeah,
so I guess
for
I'm
sure.
a +1. Yeah, I'm a +1 on having something like that. But I agree there absolutely is a process overhead in doing it, and so we shouldn't do it without being confident that the process overhead is going to be worth it. It's much harder to do comments on a PR that then has the person go and do a revision to the PR and push it back up than to suggest changes on a Google Doc and have them accepted.
You have a cap, and then let's say it gets committed, and then now someone wants to comment on a line that you aren't changing, and there was just like no way to do it.
Yeah, no, that is still a very real pain point, unfortunately. No perfect tool here. I think the real benefit of even if things start as docs, like even what I was thinking for an initial thought was translating docs. I have several design docs for discussion here. I was thinking of translating them to KEP like PRs and trying to formalize that structure, just so that I think more for discoverability and so that they don't get lost. At the
risk of like inventing something new, maybe it's the KEP comes at the end as documentation rather than part of the process.
Yeah, that's interesting.
That makes sense. Because I think the tool of using GitHub commits to do the KEP is actually pretty broken.
It's not unheard of for upstream KEPs to start as docs or email threads or whatever, and then once there's consensus, that's translated into a KEP, and the final details are worked out in the KEP, and then etc. So yeah, maybe something like that is what we end up doing here.
Yeah, because I think like the tool just imposes overhead that is pretty painful.
Yeah. Okay, well, I'll keep on thinking about that. I will at least explore what a simpler approach could be, and as we reach consensus on some of these issues, I'll think about translating them into a KEP. I think that would be a good practice to get into as we're making our bigger V1 Alpha 2 changes here. Yeah.
There is a Markdown generator from Google Doc, so
I believe it.
It's not like that horrible.
Yeah. I wanted to highlight quickly, just Harry and I had our KubeCon talk last week, and I think it went reasonably well. It was way too early in the morning for me, but we got apparently around 900 people showing up and got a lot of questions. Harry actually got these questions actually from our speaker, from our track moderator, I guess. Anyways, some of these questions are interesting. There's a few requests for rate limiting, a couple other redirects were another common feature request, a variety of other things that show the common kind of questions we were getting, and some of them were answered later in the talk, but it was still, I think, interesting to see the kinds of feedback or questions we got in that talk, and there's a lot to go through. So nothing groundbreaking here, but just if you're curious, I thought some of these questions were interesting. And the last one I wanted to cover here is PR.
You might want to, yeah, Rob, you might want to just copy that into not a cap, but just some documentation, because it's just like a gist.
Yeah.
You might want to drop it somewhere.
I don't know where it belongs. I mean, really, there's a lot of these questions aren't that notable, but there's a few that probably stand out, and maybe I should try to summarize these in a more meaningful way somewhere. Yeah. Okay, well, we're nearly out of time. I wanted to highlight there's a variety of new issues and PRs that have come in the past few days that we just don't have time to get to today. So let me just highlight that if you have extra review bandwidth, this is a great time to take a look. Earlier today, I introduced the first breaking change PR. It's a big one. Usually I'd spend more time on it in a meeting, but just running out of time. But if you're interested, it's closely related to this, which Tim was looking at the API and pointed out that, hey, you should really be following these API conventions and not use map string many places. And it was in both query and header param matching. Wow, I don't know why I said header param. So that is something that addresses. So anyway, there's a lot of issues and PRs that we just don't have time to get to today. But if you have time to review them after this call, that would be really appreciated. And a reminder, this is the beginning of our new meeting schedule. Hopefully this is working for people. And next time we'll be meeting at a completely different time of day, but 2 weeks from now, we'll be back at this time. And do give feedback on meeting times. Hopefully this is a slight improvement.
It's certainly better for me.
Good. Cool. All right. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
Thanks.